In this video, we will be using the GapMinder world graph to analyze how CO2 emissions influence different variables given country-level data. We will look at how CO2 emissions, measured by metric tons per person, are correlated with life expectancy, income per person, human development score, and child mortality rates. Then, we will compare 4 different countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Nigeria, and China, and their CO2 emissions over time. CO2 emissions are harmful for any country, for humans and for the environment, yet societies are causing these emissions for the benefit of their citizens. Cars, power plants, heating, and agriculture are some examples of situations where greenhouse gases spill into the environment. Debates involving the decrease of CO2 emissions or greenhouse gases are frequently discussed within politics. Rather than looking at total CO2 emissions within a country, we decided to compare CO2 emissions in metric tons per person between countries. This choice does not single out countries like the United States and China, who have a high population and, in turn, higher levels of greenhouse gases. We then compared the CO2 emissions in metric tons per person to the Human Development Index, a number between 0 and 1 that rates a person's life in a given country based upon health, educational level, and living standard. We found that as CO2 emissions per person falls, the Human Development Index also falls. This is very interesting. Intuitively, we thought that higher CO2 emissions would result in lower Human Development Index, yet we are not looking at total CO2 emissions, but rather at CO2 emissions per person. Therefore, when greenhouse gases per person are higher, people have better health, living standards, and education.
CO2 emission levels have varied over multiple regions of the world since the introduction of their measurements in the early 1800s. For example, greenhouse gas emissions in the United States had increased to about 20 tons a person per year until the 1980s, until they leveled off until the 2010s, where there has been a slight drop-off in emission levels. However, in Asia, CO2 emission levels were first measured in the late 1800s, and their growth was exponential up until just a few years ago. However, these differences do not take away from the fact that CO2 emissions are harmful to human health. No matter the growth rate of the levels of CO2 emissions, the amount of the particular gas in our environment is at an all-time high, and theoretically that should have extremely detrimental effects on us and the environment. However, over the course of the last 200 years or so, one can notice on the graphs that as carbon emission levels increased, child mortality rates decreased, and income levels and human life expectancy increased. This can be attributed to the development of modern technology and therefore the development of modern medicine as well. The development in modern medicine has created better pregnancy guidelines and more reliable standards of living for people of all ages, which have both led to lower child mortality rates and higher life expectancies across the globe. These developments include vaccines, drugs, and medical procedures, including bypass surgeries and organ transplants. In addition, the development in technology has created more efficient processes that have created more goods at a profitable pace, leading to higher incomes because more is being made with less materials. An example of these processes include the assembly line. In addition, countries whose CO2 levels started rising later have lower life expectancies, lower incomes, and higher child mortality rates than countries whose CO2 emission levels start rising earlier. Nigeria, as shown on the graph, is a prime example of this scenario, as their variables are at a slightly worse position compared to others. However, there could be a study conducted to test the effectiveness of multiple types of machines in terms of medicine, the automotive industry, etc. These would give us a better viewpoint as to why the variables we are observing acted the way they did and when drastic changes occurred that affected the variables. All in all, different studies would have to be done in order to connect these correlations to the causations. However, it is pretty clear that there is a relationship between the rising CO2 levels in countries across the world and these specific variables that we have observed today.
Finally, we looked at CO2 emission levels over time as a basis to compare the greenhouse gas emissions with other variables. The 4 countries we compared were the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and Nigeria. The trend for these 4 countries is that their greenhouse gas emissions greatly increased and began to round off after a certain amount of time. The amount of CO2 emissions over the history was cyclical until the Industrial Revolution, which first began in the United Kingdom in the 1700s. Since then, the amount of CO2 emissions still increased throughout the 1800s and slowed due to technological advances. The Industrial Revolution began in the United States around 1800, but that is why the CO2 emissions is much lower at 0.0372 tons per person. but begins to pick up rapidly and ends up surpassing the United Kingdom at approximately 11 tons of CO2 emission per person. The increase in CO2 emissions in the United States and the United Kingdom steadily increased from the 1800s, but the trends for China and Nigeria began later because of no data before 1900. In the first 2 years of China's data, the CO2 emissions greatly increased from 0.00024 tons per person in 1901 to 0.0411 tons per person in 1906, and this was due to the leader Sun Yat-sen's focus on improving industry. China's CO2 emission has increased at a much higher rate than the United States and the United Kingdom. In 2013, China surpassed the United Kingdom with 8 tons of emission per person. As a currently developing country, Nigeria is behind the other three countries in terms of industrialization. Therefore, their CO2 emissions is less, but is increasing and is starting to level out at 0.57 tons of emissions per person. These four countries are starting to level out in their greenhouse gas emissions due to concern of climate change and improvement in technology, such as factories and automobiles.